Object relations theories are a set of theories that look at how we interact with other objects, and an object here is a person, place, or thing. Object relations theorists are mostly interested in how we interact with other people. There are a number of theorists that have different takes on this material, so these object relations theorists don't all agree with each other. They're described in two schools, the British school and the American school. Some of the important British object relations theorists are John Bowlby, who later went on to found attachment theory, and Bowlby is mostly associated with attachment theory now. But there is some overlap between object relations and attachment theories. Melanie Klein is another important British object relations theorist. Donald Winnicott is perhaps the most important object relations theorist, at least from a social work perspective. And Fairbairn and Guntrip are also associated with the British school. The American object relations theorists include Margaret Mahler, Kernberg, Ogden, and Masterson. So here are some of the main ideas of object relations theories, and these are the ideas that these theorists have in common, basic assumptions that they share. So again, the main focus is how we relate to others, but they're really interested in our internal mental representations of others and objects. So that means how we think about, feel about, and envision other people and our relationships with them. So these internal mental representations of objects can be even more important than the actual relationships themselves, because they shape how we approach relationships and what we bring to the table. In these theories, people are the objects of our desires and fears, hence the term object relations. And these theories are not too far from other psychodynamic theories because they're focused mostly on what goes on in the mind of an individual. They focus on introjects, which are the internalized representations of objects and part objects. So that means an introject can represent a person, an object, or a characteristic of a person, like kindness or irritability. Those are part objects. And the theorists say that our internal, partly unconscious world of relationships is at least as important as the external, real relationships they represent. So this internal world is created beginning very early on with our first experiences with other human beings, and is built up over time in response to our experience. And over time, we develop this internal mental landscape that is peopled or populated with introjects, these images. And this characterizes the emotional life of the mind. So it's important to consider what a person's mental landscape looks and feels like. It could be very sparsely populated, lonely, with not too many people around, not many people who are likely to help. It could feel very warm and comfortable, with lots of support. It could be overcrowded, noisy, or demanding. It could be confusing, with different demands coming from different people or objects. So we ask, does this internal mental landscape contain soothing introjects, symbols of care that can be used by the self? Does it include harsh or abusive introjects, images taken in from experience that one may then use and repeat to oneself? There are three different ways in which we can internalize experience. The most crude process is incorporation, where this happens early in life, where the distinction between the self and another person or object is unclear, and the object is incorporated or taken in, or swallowed, if you will, in part or in whole. So in infancy, little ones don't know the difference between themselves and others, but they may incorporate experience in the form of kindness or abusive treatment, but it's taken in whole as it is, and there's no distinction that this is another person treating me in this kind or not so kind way. It's just taken in. A more sophisticated process is called introjection, where we internalize aspects of the object, the person, like warmth, or we internalize relationships with objects, like reciprocity. Now here, again, we're internalizing an aspect, not the whole thing. So this is more advanced than incorporation. And in introjection, often we are aware of the difference between ourselves and someone else. And we're looking at that object as a complex creature, and we can identify various aspects of the object, like warmth, kindness, reciprocity, irritability. So these are more fine-tuned aspects of objects than incorporation. And a third process is identification. This involves another step where an aspect of an object is internalized and it's also valued. So in addition to internalizing this idea that, here's a person who is warm and caring toward me, we take it another step and we say, well, we value that warmth and care, and we would like to be like that. So that's the identification part. It involves a value judgment and an idea that this is a characteristic that we want to have as well. Let's talk about Donald Winnicott's ideas. Winnicott generated a lot of theory. So here are some of his main ideas, and it's important to know these. You know from your reading that Winnicott was a very provocative writer, and he liked to write in paradox, and he liked sayings and phrases that really evoked reactions. So one of his famous sayings is, "There's no such thing as an infant." What does he mean by this? Well, he means that infants don't exist on their own. They have to have caregivers or they don't survive. And he focused a lot on what he called the dance between the infant and primary caregiver. And in his world of the 1950s and 60s, the primary caregiver was, he thought, usually the mother. So the dance between the infant and mother, their beginning relationship, how they communicate back and forth, how they learn each other's signals, is a very important beginning for object relations, because it teaches us what people are like, what relationships might be like. And Winnicott said that in order to facilitate this process, mothers should be completely preoccupied with their infant for the first 3 months of the infant's life. He called this primary maternal preoccupation. And he thought it was almost a biological imperative. He said he thought that new mothers just naturally were preoccupied with their infants, unable to focus on anything else. And that had terrific survival value for the species and was good for infants. He thought mothers should respond this way, and that mothers who didn't were not doing it right. There was maybe something wrong with them. But primary maternal preoccupation is something that should happen, in his view. We know now that it is common, but it doesn't always happen, that moms experience this. And if it doesn't happen, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. Some moms, out of necessity, have to go back to work before the first 3 months are up, and it's not possible to focus on the infant alone. But this idea, Winnicott's idea of a primary maternal preoccupation lasting 3 months, did give way to the American Family Leave Act. So, that's a federal law that says that any employer with over, I forget whether it's 100 or 150 employees, must allow women to take a 3-month leave of absence when a child is born to care for them. Now, in that absence, the employee does not have to be paid, but she cannot be fired. She must be able to have her job back at the end of 3 months. And this idea comes directly from Winnicott's theory and his idea of primary maternal preoccupation. So the idea is that our employers should facilitate this, at least in part. Another main idea here is that moms need to be only good enough. So what does that mean? We want care for infants and children to be sensitive and responsive. That means mothers and other caregivers should pay close attention to an infant's cues, should try to figure out what it is that an infant wants and needs at any particular point in time, and should try to respond accordingly. But mothers and others cannot be perfect and will sometimes make mistakes. They will sometimes miss infants' cues or show what Winnicott called empathetic failures, failing to understand what an infant wants. And not only is that inevitable, but it actually is healthy for child development. It's healthy for the child that the mom and others make mistakes sometimes, because it teaches the young child that the world is not going to always satisfy every need and want and wish all the time. That's not how it works. Winnicott described the holding environment as the environment that mom, mostly, but others create for the infant. And it literally means what it feels like to the infant to be held by others, metaphorically and literally. What does life feel like to the infant? When the infant's being held, is it a gentle, rocking, caressing, warm feeling? Is it rough, harsh, quickly disrupted, full of surprises? Is it abusive? Well, these things matter. The qualities of the holding environment, said Winnicott, teach us about the world, and our first assumptions about what the world will be like come from this early experience. Winnicott also talked about another realm in the environment in early childhood called the potential space. He actually called this potential space for development. Now, the potential space is a bit wider than the holding environment. It's the area in which a child can explore once she's able to move, crawl, or walk. It's often the living room floor, a playroom floor, a daycare center, areas that kids can explore a little bit on their own. And this is called the potential space for development because what's in that space really matters in terms of how kids begin to understand the world. So what's there in the potential space for infants and young children? Is it a safe space? Are there broken or dangerous objects that they have to be kept away from? Are there soft, cuddly, warm things? Are there picture books, toys, objects to manipulate, things to explore? The qualities of this potential space matter because they shape learning, and again, they shape our early experiences of the world. And they communicate to us what the world is like. Winnicott wrote a lot about how we interact with objects and about certain kinds of objects that help us in development. And one of these objects is the transitional object. Winnicott thought that children tend to have one favorite object, a transitional object, that can help them manage their feelings, their fears, in the absence of a caregiver. So he thought that an infant will project its loving fondness for a caregiver onto one object, usually a soft, cuddly thing. And then when the infant looks at that object, the object seems to reflect back those loving, caring feelings. And that gives the infant a sense of comfort Okay, so this transitional object takes on almost magical, comforting power for the infant. And if mom leaves the room, the infant can turn to this warm, fuzzy thing and feel comforted. So it helps the infant manage this transition from being with the caregiver to being alone. And it helps the infant learn to soothe herself. Now, Winnicott thought that infants should have transitional objects, but again, we know that not all infants do, and there's nothing wrong with an infant or child who does not have a transitional object. Some infants and children can make the transition on their own without a thing. We also know that the use of transitional objects is much less common in Eastern and global Southern societies than in the West. Winnicott talked about other kinds of objects too, and so another kind I'll mention are linking objects. So a linking object is something that stands in for someone who has departed, usually someone who has died. It's something that reminds us of a loved one who's no longer with us. Again, an object that we choose for the purposes of maintaining that sense of connection, and it can help in the grieving process. Winnicott also wrote about the development of a true self and false self. Now, the true self is our sort of authentic self. It represents how we really think and feel. And the false self involves some pretense, some play acting, perhaps people pleasing, but acting in ways that really aren't aimed at showing who we really are, but are aimed at placating or satisfying or pleasing others. Now, he thought that we all, sometimes will show a false self. Sometimes we think we have to act in a certain way for a certain audience. And to some extent, that's normal. He was concerned about the development of sort of over-reliance on a false self. And he thought that there are young children who grow up thinking they always have to please others, they always have to act in a certain way, so that the false self becomes predominant. And it's harder for them to express their true self. The true self takes a back seat. He thought that was not healthy. That he defined mental illness as the absence of the ability to be one's true self in the presence of others. Winnicott also talked about a sort of stage-like journey from complete dependence, absolute dependence on a caregiver, toward independence, reliance on oneself. Now, this is a very Western ideal, this idea that child development is really aimed at producing independent, autonomous people. In non-Western cultures, you don't see this ideal. And in fact, in some Eastern and global Southern cultures, the idea is quite the opposite. The idea is that children are born too separate, too independent, and they need to be brought into the family or the tribe or the clan or the community. They need to develop a sense of relatedness. But here you see the influence of Western culture. The outcome is independence. So Winnicott described this journey in 3 stages: absolute dependence, relative dependence, and toward independence. Okay, I think I've said in class that I don't think these are particularly descriptive, but at the beginning, in the dependent phase, he does talk in very interesting ways about our relationships with objects. So he talks about holding. The way that the child is held communicates a lot about the world and about other people. So here we're talking again about the holding environment. What is that like? It matters greatly. And handling, how the child is touched. What kind of touch does the child receive on her skin? How does the child handle objects? At about 3 months, we're able to hold things. And we learn a lot about the world by handling objects. And how are objects presented to us? Winnicott thought it was very important to think about the ways in which children are presented with a breast or bottle for feeding. What's the environment in which that happens? Is it a calm, safe environment where objects are presented as soothing, nourishing things? Or is it full of conflict and fear and surprise? One of Winnicott's ideas is that mothers and fathers will have empathetic failures. They will sometimes fail to understand what it is the child wants or needs. And I said before, this fits in with this idea of a good enough mother. A good enough mother is mostly sensitive and responsive, but makes these empathetic failures. And that's okay. It's actually a good thing for child development. Winnicott thought that when this happens early on, the infant goes through a mental process that's pretty interesting. He said that the subject, the infant, destroys the object. In this case, the object is the mother. So what's happening here? Mom has made an empathetic failure. She doesn't understand what the child needs. Maybe the child's hungry and she's not responding appropriately. And Winnicott theorized that when this happens, the first few times anyway, the infant became enraged at mom for not meeting its needs. And because the infant sees himself or herself as the center of the universe and all-powerful, imagines that he or she could destroy mom with her anger. So the infant is so mad, she rages at mom and believes that she can have mom disappeared. Well, it doesn't work. And mom survives this onslaught, which of course doesn't happen except for that the baby cries. And the baby learns that she can't destroy mom, no matter how angry she gets. Mom survives, and they go on. And the baby will get fed. Maybe not exactly when she wants to, but in time. So the baby learns to manage through empathetic failures and learns that the world is not always perfect. And that's an important lesson. Winnicott also talked about sort of regression toward a more dependent state. And we saw this when we were talking about the ego psychologists. They talk about regression as a defense mechanism. But Winnicott thought that this regression, under stress, is an opportunity for reworking early traumas and conflicts. Let's move now to talking about Margaret Mahler, an American object relations theorist. Mahler was actually born in Germany and moved to the US and taught in a large Midwestern university. Her most influential work is the book with colleagues called The Psychological Birth of the Human Infant. And here she's interested in the sort of psychological awakening, if you will, of human infants. She describes a process of separation and individuation as being central for object relations. And again, separation, individuation, very Western ideas about independence and autonomy. And she describes this process as having 4 stages: autistic, symbiotic. Separation, individuation is also the name of the 3rd stage, and it's the name of the process itself. It's a little confusing. And the 4th stage is called on the way to object constancy. Let's talk about each of these stages a bit more. So the autistic phase, in the first 6 weeks of life, is thought to be an objectless state. Now, she's not using the term autistic the way we use it today. She's not talking about somebody on the autistic spectrum. She's talking about being born into a sense of an objectless world, that everything is kind of blurry. There aren't distinct objects. Everything's kind of connected. It's cloudy. It's a blur. And Then as we begin to distinguish objects, we can see faces, we can see people's reactions to us, and we begin to recognize that there is somebody or some bodies who care for us. We enter what she called a symbiotic state, where the infant is aware of self and others, but there's a sense of complete union with the infant and caregiver. So when the infant receives food and care, there's the sense of sort of blissful union with mom or other caregiver. So let me just say that these first two states really require some imagination on Mahler's part about what's going on in the mind of the infant. And we can't know whether she's right or wrong about that. It's this third phase that's most important, the separation individuation or hatching phase. And it has these three subphases. So Mahler said that from about 5 to 12 months, infants show growing interest in the world and in objects in their world. And she said this based on her own observational research of mother-infant dyads in her laboratory. So she had mother-infant dyads come into the university lab and she videotaped their interactions, and she had them come back many times over several years and watched the dyads develop. And this the second half of the first year, she noticed that kids were very interested in exploring the things in their world. And then in the next year, they entered this subphase that she calls practicing. While the exploration continues, but now they're able to move a little bit more than they were before, and they move around the room, her lab, and they keep coming back to mom for what Mahler called emotional refueling. So the infant is going out and grabbing a toy and seeing what it can do with this toy, and then coming back to mom, showing mom what it found, and just getting some reassurance from mom that it's okay to explore. And then out and back and out and back, kind of like a yo-yo. The attachment theorists would call this, returning to a secure base, but Mahler didn't use that term. So this practicing continues until about 2 years of life, and the child is becoming more and more bold in practicing. So they're going first a few feet away from mom, and then to the other side of the room, and then outside and down the blocks a little bit. And emotional refueling gives them confidence that it's okay to explore. Then we enter a really interesting subphase that's very important in Mahler's theory, and this is the phase called rapprochement that happens somewhere between 2 and 3 years of age. And at this point, the child has done a lot of exploring and emotional refueling and is beginning to see that she is a separate person from mom and others, and is beginning to get a sense of her own identity and will and self, and has learned the important word no. So she's asserting her will at times. And she expresses what Mahler called ambitendency, which is a strong fluctuation between wanting two opposite things. So this is not ambivalence. It's not having mixed feelings. It's about having strong opposite feelings. And it often appears when children ask their parents to do something for them, but then insist that they want to do it themselves. So they're really exploring their own abilities and autonomy. And they'll say, I want to do it myself. You do it for me. I do it. You do it. And it's confusing. They want both things, and they can't have both things. So it's difficult for parents to respond. But somehow in this phase, the young child and parent really need to renegotiate how they relate to each other so that the parent can acknowledge the child's growing independence and autonomy and still provide a safe place to return to. And the child can depend on the parent while also having confidence in her desire to explore and learn more about the world. Once rapprochement is resolved, then Mahler said we are on the way to object constancy, which is the development of a stable, benign, largely positive representations of others. So we now have a sense of ourself and others, and we're on the way. This idea of object constancy is not the same thing as object permanence, which is Piaget's idea. We'll come back to this in a few weeks. Piaget's object permanence has no affective or emotional dimension. Object constancy, because it's about relationships with other people, does have both cognitive and affective dimensions. But again, this fourth stage happens with the resolution of ambitendency. Melanie Klein is another object relations theorist, a drive theorist. She starts from Sigmund Freud's idea that we have these innate and very important drives, but noted that these drives are inherently directed toward objects, often toward other people. So she's both a drive theorist and an object relations theorist. Melanie Klein talked about internal positions or states, ways of perceiving and feeling, not stages. She didn't like stage models of development. She thought that these internal positions could be very fleeting. They could come and go. So in this sense, it's like Pine's developmental moments, like a teachable moment. And we could go in and out of different states. She described a number of different states or positions, but we'll talk about two here. One is the position that Melanie Klein thought we were all born into, and that is something she called a paranoid schizoid position. So unlike Margaret Mahler, who thought we were born into this sort of fuzzy, clouded, indeterminate world where things were kind of blurry and unclear to us, Melanie Klein thought we were born into a world in which we're aware of parts of objects, we can see some things, but they don't make sense to us. And the world seems fragmented, full of surprises, and that's fear-inducing. So we are paranoid, fearful, and schizoid, out of touch with reality in this position. The world is unpredictable. Objects are experienced as parts, as fragmented pieces, and the world is a scary place. May say a lot about Melanie Klein's assumptions about the world. Now she said that this is a position we can go back to when we're feeling stressed, when we're feeling threatened. We can go back to this paranoid schizoid position where the world is scary and things are unpredictable and we're full of fear. Another position that she described that's important for us is called the depressive position. Now she doesn't mean depression in the clinical sense of clinical depression. She's talking here about the loss of innocence that happens after a young child has integrated the good and bad parts of themselves or someone else. So this is similar to Winnicott's idea of the subject destroying the object. So when the baby realizes that mom has committed an empathetic failure and is angry at this bad mom, she will soon realize that mom survives that anger and that mom is actually good and bad. And it's this integration of good and bad images of self and others that Melanie Klein thought was very important. For us to learn that other people are complex and multifaceted, this is an important phase because it keeps us from splitting our views of objects into all good or all bad. And Klein said that once we've done this, once we stop splitting and we integrate good and bad parts of ourself and others, there is a loss of innocence because the young child thinks, according to Klein, that there can't be an all good person. Mom can't be all good, and I can't be all good. And that's what leads to the depressive position. So it happens after splitting is resolved, after this integration. There's, she thought, a sadness that perfection is not possible. Again, reading the minds of very young children. So we've mentioned some critiques of object relations theories. One is that they are, like all theories, fairly culture-bound, and there is this Western emphasis on separation and independence that does not characterize assumptions of all cultures. Another critique is that these theories focused initially on stay-at-home mothers. The assumption was that the mother would be the primary caregiver and that it was really up to mom to do most of the heavy lifting in terms of child development. So Winnicott, talked about the good enough mother. We now talk about good enough caregivers. And we know from empirical research that it doesn't matter the gender of a caregiver. It doesn't really matter how many caregivers live in a home. Sexual orientation is irrelevant for caregivers. What matters is the quality of care that infants and young children receive. And often that is from multiple caregivers, not a single person. And that's just fine. Again, it depends, but the quality of care matters. So in that sense, the ideas of the qualities of the holding environment, the qualities of the potential space for development are important, but it's not necessarily up to the mother or to any single person to provide all that. And then finally, in terms of critiques, I would say that there's a very limited research base for these theories. With the exception of Mahler, who did a lot of observational studies, most of the object relations theorists did not do their own empirical research, and the theories are speculative in many aspects. So how do we use object relations theories in social work? Well, I mentioned that Winnicott's ideas have been used to argue for support for caregivers in terms of parental leave, and to argue that, supporting caregivers is the best way to support early childhood development in the first year or two of a child's life. These theories have also been used to advocate for early intervention with parents and infants to create better holding environments and better potential spaces for development. And there are interventions, both parent education and parent-child interaction interventions, that are used when children have special characteristics or needs. These interventions are often used when the dyad or triad, multiple caregivers and child, are not off to a good start. So parent-child interaction therapy, for example, is used to help the dyad do a better dance, in Winnicott's words, help the dyad relate to each other, understand each other, respond to each other more sensitively. Object relations theory can be useful in assessment as well. For example, in Freudian theory, assessment of the transference focused on what the client brings into the therapy room, and with the idea that the client is bringing in her feelings about a parent, the parent of the same sex as the therapist, and that the therapist can analyze the transference to understand the patient's relationships with her father or mother. Well, from an object relations theory perspective, you can use what the client brings in to the treatment room in many other ways. So the idea is the client's bringing in a whole history of experiences with other people and the world, and her object relations reflect that internal mental set of representations of others. So it's not just transference, it's about object relations more broadly. In treatment, sometimes social workers say that they're recreating the holding environment. I think if that means that they're trying to be nurturing and supportive for clients, that's fine. But I think it may be more accurate to say that we're trying to create a good potential space for development, for new experiences with another human being, a potential space to examine, for the client to examine her own experiences and history and wishes and plans for the future. So in that sense, this potential space for development that is treatment can be used to examine the past and create new experiences for the future.